My name is Elizabeth Manns, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition Show. This is the November 15th, 2021 edition of the show. It is week 376 and the 304th show that we have done since the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital. The April 4th Coalition's mission statement is, we are for workers' rights and collective bargaining rights and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is the custom, we put the emphasis on Article 23 at the start of the show.
So, Article 23, Section 1, everyone has the right to work, the free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. Number 2, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and herself or his and or her family an existence worthy of human dignity and if supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Number 4, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of her or his interests. At this time, we always do give a thank you to both David Fabiano, who is the TV studio director, and Michael Putnam, who is the program director for the community radio station. Michael airs our show on the community radio, WMNB-LP 107.1, on Fridays at 6 p.m. And as always, if there's a long pause, we're probably showing a video at that point in the show, if you don't get it, the audio portion. And I'm going to toss it over to Dick.
Okay, it's become our tradition that we set aside a few minutes to talk about the people who were native to this country prior to the Europeans coming. And today we have a video that was from YouTube, but I think it has something to do with NBC or whatever that produced it, but it's about Sitting Bull and the fight for the Black Hills.
Right.
And we have some connection to that. A former Drury High School student who, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, was a member of the Sioux tribe until she passed away just this year. But she was also historian for the Sioux tribe. So I thought we'd give a little bit of history. I mean, the fight against those pipelines and about those South Dakota, North Dakota. It's still a battle, but this little bit of history, I think, will help us put it in perspective.
Okay.
The grasslands of the Dakota Territory. It was here in June 1876 that the people of a Lakota Sioux village sat in a circle and watched as their chief performed a sacred ceremony known as the Sun Dance. During the ceremony, the chief claimed to have had a vision. The Lakota would succeed in battle against U.S. troops, a prophecy that would be fulfilled just a few days later near what whites called the Little Bighorn River. The Lakota chief who had this vision was called Tatanka Iotake. Raised in what is now North and South Dakota, he was a member of the Hunkpapa Band of the Lakota, part of the 7 Council Fires of the Great Sioux Nation. At 14 years old, after proving his courage in a fight against Crow Indians, his father gave him the name Sitting Bull. By the 1860s, the Lakota had grown concerned about the encroachment on their land by white settlers and soldiers. A key worry was the sacred Black Hills, sacred because it was from these hills that the Lakota believed they had emerged into this world and where they hunted for food. Tensions quickly began to mount and violence broke out. In an attempt to end the fighting, U.S. Army leaders and several Indian chiefs agreed to the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. It promised to end hostilities on both sides and gave the Lakotas the right to keep the Black Hills. From this day forward, the treaty stated, all war between the parties to this agreement shall forever cease. But soon after the signing of the treaty, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, bringing streams of white miners and settlers onto Lakota land. War returned. To help defend their land, Sitting Bull invited warriors from neighboring nations of Cheyenne and Arapaho to join the Lakotas. My brothers, Sitting Bull said, shall we submit or shall we say to them, first kill me before you take possession of my land? It was at this time that Sitting Bull performed the Sundance ritual and had the vision of victory over the soldiers. On June 25, 1876, almost 300 U.S. soldiers, led by General George Custer, launched an ill-planned attack on the large Lakota camp near the Little Bighorn River. Though victorious at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Lakotas had not won the conflict. The U.S. government ultimately forced them to surrender the Black Hills and move on to reservations. Today, Lakotas continue to fight for the return of the Black Hills. Though struggling with poverty, they have refused millions of dollars from the U.S. government as compensation for the hills.
To take that money and say, we will bless the stealing of our land, will be to accept spiritual poverty.
Like Sitting Bull, the Lakotas won't give up on the return of their sacred land.
It's interesting.
It is,
Yeah.
and in truth, he never lost a battle. They simply just couldn't win the war because their way of life was dwindling, the means to live it. So eventually hunger
Well, they
drove them.
Yeah, they had an agreement. They had an agreement.
did have an
But
agreement.
gold got in the way.
Yes, gold
The search for gold.
and greed got in the way as usual.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's usually the reason every agreement gets broken or one power tries to take something from another is because they want it.
It's a never-ending battle that,
Yeah.
the battle for greed. And we're seeing a lot of that right now.
Yep, it's playing out right now.
Right, just like the Lakotas and
Right,
and
it's greed
the
that's
Sioux,
keeping
are in poverty. There's a lot of people in poverty across the country.
country. And it's greed that's keeping people from being able to be lifted out.
Yeah, and all across the world too. But
Across-
right now we have a video by Robert Reich that's talking a little bit. I think it's talking about the strikes that have been going
We're
on.
and how they're not likely to end, I believe.
Right, and it has, the labor strike wave, is it at a tipping point? That's the question he's
Right.
asking, and it's hard when you're in the middle of something to really know.
If this is it or not, because I was asking that a couple weeks ago when
Yeah.
we first were discussing it. Is this something that has legs or is it going to
Right,
fade?
so he's making a comparison, like we're in the post-pandemic, so he's talking about it in the post-World War
Two
II
right,
era,
he's comparing the two.
1946. So why don't we watch that video and then see what we can draw from it.
America is on strike. From Alabama to the Midwest to California, workers across industries are heading to the picket lines. We haven't seen this kind of labor uprising in decades. So what can we learn from the big wave of strikes in 1946 after World War II? Just as with the pandemic, lots of Americans during the war were needed to do dangerous and difficult work and asked to make sacrifices for the public good. And as with the pandemic, the war ended with a massive pent-up consumer demand for goods and services, giving workers more bargaining leverage as they reevaluated their lives and jobs. American workers during the war were analogous to essential workers during the pandemic. They worked long and grueling hours under sometimes life-threatening conditions. When the war ended, they expected to be repaid for their sacrifices, but their employers weren't so willing. Today's essential workers are enduring the same. From the end of 1945 into 1946, over 5 million workers across America went on strike to demand better pay and working conditions. Railroad workers, steel workers, miners, meat packers, electrical workers, and cross-industry general strikes in Oakland, Pittsburgh, and Rochester brought the country to a standstill. The result? Union membership, which had doubled during the war, continued to soar. Workers won significant gains. The United Auto Workers secured a long-term deal with the big three automakers that guaranteed them extensive benefits, time off, and pay increases that became the standard for labor contracts. Economic gains were shared widely, and America built the largest middle class the world had ever seen. For the next 30 years, the gains from the post-war economic expansion were shared. Of course, it was far from perfect. Women returned to second-class economic roles. People of color were largely excluded from the prosperity. But post-war labor activism remained high and was central to broader social movements. In 1968, thousands of black sanitation workers in Memphis walked off the job to demand dignity and racial justice, eventually forcing the city to recognize their union and give them higher wages. Then in the late 1970s, the dawn of hostile corporate takeovers and trickle-down economics pushed CEOs to put shareholder returns above all else. And in 1981, Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, ushering in an era of union bashing and pro-corporate governance that's continued ever since. The strike wave of 1946 may seem like distant history, but today we're at a similar inflection point, one with even higher stakes. 40 years of union busting and trickle-down baloney is crushing the working class. Union membership is at a record low. Wealth inequality is worse than it's been in a century. But hundreds of thousands of American workers are fighting back and demanding better pay and working conditions. 10,000 John Deere workers, over 1,000 Alabama coal miners, New York City taxi drivers, healthcare workers, food production plant workers at multiple companies. Where will this 21st century strike wave take us? It's unclear that this will be a turning point, but it can and should be. Public support for unions is at a 50-year high, but less than 7% of private sector workers are unionized. The Protecting the Right to Organize Act, passed in the House earlier this year, would level the playing field by making it easier for workers to unionize and imposing real penalties on businesses that break labor laws. It's the toughest labor law reform in a generation. Passing it is absolutely essential to rebuilding worker power and economic prosperity. Beyond this crucial legislation, we must shift our thinking about the economic system, learn from the past, and not repeat the mistakes of Reaganism. Trickle-down economics is nothing more than a cruel hoax designed to enrich the wealthy and corporations while draining money from the middle class and the poor. We can't let ourselves fall prey to the same fear-mongering that destroyed the labor wins of the post-war years. And we can never forget that the working people of America outnumber the billionaires in moneyed interests by a wide margin. If we show solidarity, we can reverse 40 years of stagnant wages, declining economic security, and widening inequality, and build a more prosperous middle class where the gains are shared by everyone. Let's seize the moment.
Seize the day.
Seize the day, carpe diem, as they say.
Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time she is a-flying.
Oh, definitely. And it is a time because workers have had time to reflect, thanks to COVID-19, as to whether or
Yes.
not they're getting their fair share or not. And
Yeah, I can speak, from experience, being hailed as an essential worker, but then finding out the Commonwealth of Massachusetts didn't consider us one, and they didn't even consider to put us in line for getting the vaccination.
shots. Yep.
And, so, as a federal employee, the federal government did nothing for the federal employees of the Postal Service to get them vaccinated, even
right.
though,
You know,
we're out
it's
there.
kind of ironic because I was looking at the CDC guidelines now for the booster shot. The U.S. Post Office worker is listed in there
Right.
as somebody who qualifies for the booster
But
shot.
before,
But before that, no, it was like, it wasn't even a thought.
right, it just,
And
so
anyways,
that's just from my perspective as a postal worker, but I mean, you got people who work, at Burger King, or you work at McDonald's, or a lot
all
of
the
jobs.
grocery stores. I
Yeah,
used to work in a grocery
yeah,
store.
all those jobs that are essential,
Essential.
They-
They're only essential now because they realized when they weren't being done, somebody had to do it.
Right, when everybody else was staying home, these people had to be there to make
Right,
sure
they
that.
had to help with the food distribution and everything else.
Yeah, it's almost like, You know, we were,
It's like a light switch went on somewhere.
yeah, we were, you know, although we didn't have the prestige of the other jobs,
Right.
those prestigious jobs could stay home and do their work from home.
Right.
They didn't need to show up and actually do it. The poor people working in the meat packing industry, the poultry
Sure.
industry, all those people, the lowest paid,
Yep.
you know, probably the worst working conditions.
In the world,
Yeah.
most prime
Yeah, and
hunting ground
and they
COVID.
probably had the highest rates of COVID.
In the workplace, yes,
Yeah.
they did. The meat packing plants and
Yeah. And
all the food production plants, even Kellogg
yeah, it
had
was,
high.
and so we're seeing that. Now, it's interesting, he compared it to 1946, and
Right.
And-
His theory is, I think, is that because everybody made sacrifices at that point in time, and then finally the need for sacrifice was over and they were ready to be rewarded, and it didn't happen. We're not quite at the end of the need for sacrifice, but it's nearing it as the vaccines get better and better. So there's a pent-up demand now for a recognition of the sacrifice and a reward.
right, but there's also a lot of pent-up anger, too.
Yes,
And,
there is.
And some people are turning to violence, threatening violence with their political opponents. If people don't agree with a certain
Mm-hmm. With their
point of
point
view,
of view?
there's no
No balance.
respect or considering other people the loyal opposition.
Right.
You know, they're
That's
the
true.
enemy, and they need, you know,
Yeah,
the death threats even to Republicans that were a very small group of Republicans in the House, maybe 11 or 12 voted for the infrastructure bill, but then they got death threats from,
From people who
From
did
people-
it because they didn't
they
stick.
didn't like, it's an us or them, there's no working together. So I wanted to look at someone that faced, you know, real cruelty, colonization, Mahatma Gandhi, but he was a teacher. You know, he was
And
a
a
teacher
lawyer.
for the entire world
Yes,
on how you can overcome obstacles, but you don't have to do it violently. And that's what
Where
I
you
would
wanted
like people
people to go?
to look at, you know?
And to realize violence probably will not work.
No, there's
No.
no end to it. So if we can watch this video on Mahatma Gandhi and the influence he had on the world.
On a January morning in 1915, a ship landed in Bombay from South Africa. After 27 years away from India, Mohandas Gandhi was coming home. Waiting for this humble man were crowds of people who had never seen Gandhi in person, but his return held great promise for them. As a lawyer in white-ruled South Africa, Gandhi had won rights for the 75,000 Indians living there. He did this by using a new form of protest that he called satyagraha, derived from the Sanskrit words meaning truth and force. Gandhi firmly believed that people could never win their rights through violence. Satyagraha was more than just a political tactic for Gandhi. It was a moral force, and it had gained him thousands of followers back home. One of them was the writer Rabindranath Tagore, who gave Gandhi the title Mahatma, meaning great soul. During his time away, Gandhi had traded in the suit and tie of a British-trained lawyer for the uniform of the lower classes, the dhoti, a traditional loincloth made of rough, simple fabric. Now back in India, Gandhi founded an ashram, a self-reliant community, and sat at a wooden spinning wheel every day, making thread for the dhoti. As he turned cotton into thread, he was showing Indians that instead of sending their cotton away to England to be made into textiles, they could make cloth themselves. Soon, people all over India were learning how to spin and weave. It was a first step towards India's independence from British rule. Gandhi began to travel, demanding independence for India. He held peaceful protests, willingly went to prison, and even staged hunger strikes against laws that he felt were unjust. One of those laws prohibited Indians from making their own salt. Gandhi decided he would walk 240 miles to the coast to protest the law, along with 78 followers. Soon they had swelled to 1,000. Once he reached the sea, Gandhi bent down and collected a few grains of salt. he had broken the law. Across the country, Indians did the same. They boiled salt water to extract the salt. They also boycotted British goods. 50,000 people were sent to prison, but the protesters committed no violence. Gandhi became known worldwide, and the British began to lose their grip on India.
My speeches at the Round Table Conference have all officially reported it is complete independence that we want.
Offered freedom by British Prime Minister Attlee in March.
By the end of World War II, India would gain its independence. But Gandhi wouldn't celebrate. He had dreamed of a united India where Hindus, Muslim, and Sikh would live side by side in peace.
But settlement of India's tangled affairs presented many problems. The Muslims insisted on their demand for their own separate state and complete independence from the Hindu majority.
Instead, the subcontinent would be divided into a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan. With independence came large-scale outbreaks of violence. It was on January 30th, 1948, while he was praying for peace, that Gandhi was gunned down by a Hindu extremist. Despite the divisions in India, Gandhi became a symbol of truth and nonviolence throughout the world.
To all South Africans, today is a day like no other before it.
And since his death, others have used Gandhi's method of satyagraha to fight for peace.
In Jackson, Mississippi this year, a sit-in group, including whites as well as Negroes, stoically faced a moment of grotesque violence.
As Gandhi wrote in 1946, mankind has to get out of violence only through nonviolence. Hatred can be overcome only by love.
It's quite an example.
Yes, he is a powerful example, and he inspired many more, not only Mandela and Martin Luther King, but I'm sure many others along the way. And to achieve it, and you compare him to Sitting Bull, who used violence in an effort to protect and preserve his way of life, and he lost in the end, whereas Mahatma Gandhi was able to win his battles and gain recognition, for India and independence. And he also got, in South Africa, he got fairness for the Indian population in South Africa, which had to be a battle as well. Had to be a difficult achievement.
Right, because they were considered coloreds.
Right.
They weren't the South African blacks, but they were not considered on a par with, in the apartheid regime, they weren't with whites. It's interesting, if you read Mahatma Gandhi's biography, he was really a student of Leo Tolstoy in Russia, and he had certain, and Tolstoy was a student of the American Quakers, and then Martin Luther King ended up being a student of Gandhi's. But I mean, there are some basic, there are some basic Hindu and Buddhist and Christian mystic feelings about nonviolence.
Yes, I mean, I don't know of any religious faith that actually calls for violence to accomplish anything.
Right, and that's why we as a society,
mankind decides to do it.
Yeah, we as a society, we have to start thinking of others as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to repeat any of Martin Luther King's 10 for nonviolence?
If you'd like, you can do that. The volunteers sought for a
nonviolent army.
Yeah.
Which he wanted you to meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and the world. Refrain from violence of the fist, tongue, or heart. strive to be good in spiritual and bodily health. And lastly, the last part is a technical one about following the direction of the movement leaders and captains in a demonstration, and not to go off on your own.
Well, this was like part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when they had these marches. You know, in order to participate in the march, you had to sign this, and it says, "I sign this, and having seriously considered what I do, and with the determination and will to preserve," and they give your name, address, phone number, and then the nearest relative, because they were headed
They were
towards
expecting
violence. But
possibly
you
death.
know, it wasn't just, hey, everybody show up to the Capitol on January 6th. Just show up,
Just
and
show
all
up and do
hell's
whatever
going to
you
break
want.
loose.
Right, no,
This
nothing
was
like
not.
that.
This was planned, well thought out, and that's what Gandhi did too. He didn't just say, "Oh, let's go make some salt." He thought out what was going to happen. He knew he was going to get arrested at a certain point, but he had planned for it.
Right.
You know, and did it in a nonviolent way, and he did it because, you know, they were looking for reconciliation, just like Martin Luther King says. You know, we all remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory.
Right.
And that's what we need as a society.
We need to get back to seeking
Yes.
reconciliation and justice and understanding for all.
Yeah, and we'll have to save that Pete Seeger.
We might have to. You got a minute 28.
If you want to go into it, Pete Seeger has a song that maybe we'll finish the show with. Just
Yeah, we'll just finish the show there, and then you can roll the credits.
yeah. Thank you very much, Dave.
One blue sky above us, one ocean lapping all our shore, one earth so green and round, who could ask for more? And because I love you, I'll give it one more try to show my rainbow race it's too soon to die. Some folks want to be like an ostrich, bury their heads in the sand. Some hope that plastic dreams can unclench all those greedy hands. Some hope to take the easy